Thank you so much, Renee and Terry. I'm extremely pleased and honored to be speaking to you. I've had a long-term relationship with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, partly because we both have this intense interest in spiritual nonviolence. And as you may be aware, in 2005, Rabbi Michael Lerner and I put on the Spiritual Activism Conference in Berkeley that 1,400 people came to, and that was considered to be a really big launch. At that event, I told the following story that Jim Forrest, when he was the head of IFOR in, this is part of a sound and light show that goes on. Jim was, he came back from an international peace meeting in Italy, and he was kind of shaken. And I said, Jim, what's up? And he said, well, I finally figured out the purpose of the peace movement. I said, for heaven's sakes, Jim, tell me. You know, I've been doing this now for a quarter of a century. What are we here for? And he said, the purpose of the peace movement is to take the angriest people in the world and keep them out of the military. I was so pleased with FOR that I did do a pilgrimage when I was in Cologne, Germany. About 8 years ago, I went to the railway station and I went to famous Bahnsteig 7, track 7, and stood there where Mr. Hodgkins and Mr. Siegfried Schulze had done the famous handshake that started this august organization 100 years ago. And I'm also pleased to say that it was FOR that published the first version of this book. It was called Steps of Nonviolence. It wasn't nearly as handsome as it is now. And I want to say a little bit about it because once I get started with my talk, I forget to do the advertisement, the word from our sponsor. This book is short, which is a great advantage. It's inexpensive, which is an incredible advantage. And it represents the distillation of everything that I've been able to kind of put together about the basic strategies of nonviolence in my whole, career of working on this so intensely. The reason for this book really came about in June of 1989 when the terrible massacre of students took place in Tiananmen Square. I was sitting with some colleagues. We knew that they were making some mistakes, and we knew that they were endangering their lives, and there was nothing we can do about it. There was no internet at that time. We had to sit there and watch the tanks roll in and kill all of kill all of those young people. I was the active professor at the time. Students were and still are very dear to me, and the incredible frustration of knowing that we could have helped if only we had somehow been able to reach them has led to this lifelong search to distill the best practices of nonviolence. And the motto of the Metta Center is to help people practice nonviolence more safely and more effectively. So with that, let me launch into my talk. I feel a little bit like Richard Nixon in a funny way. He once got up and said, I know I don't look like him, but he once got up and he said, before I give my speech, I'd like to say something. So there I said it, and now let me begin my speech. I really don't have much of an excuse for showing this beautiful little fawn, but as I was asked to give a TEDx talk on the subject that we're going to be talking about today, the news story, where does it come from, the centrality of nonviolence. And I had to reduce everything I've been working on for the last 30 years into 18 minutes. I said, how am I going to do this? I looked out the window and there was a doe acting a little strangely, and I walked over and sure enough, this little guy had just been born. And so it inspired me, and I thought it might put us all in the right mood for this talk. Well, let me begin with a story. How many of you know who this lady is? we should all know this woman, and we should know the story. Her name is Antoinette Tuff. She's approximately the most appropriately named human being on the planet. She was a bookkeeper in a school with about 800 students in Decatur, Georgia. A very deranged young man who was off his psychotropic medicines came into the school with very heavy weapons, assault rifles, and so forth, all the stuff which is so easy to come by in this country. And planning mayhem, he snuck through the security door, and he was confronted by Antoinette, who looked at him and said, gee, I'm so sorry, you really look troubled. I have troubles too. You want to hear about my recent divorce? You know, everyone has to go through trouble in this life. And I think you're going to be fine. I think you're going to make it. And I love you, she said to him. And she gradually talked him down and told him, please, why don't you put your weapons up here on my desk? So he did, and she said, you lie down and tell me when you're ready, and I'll call the police. Which he did. He lay down, obediently put his hands behind his back, and she called the SWAT team, which was standing outside, and they came running in. And you can actually hear the 9/11 tapes where they come in making absolute ass of themselves. You know, all right, everybody, get down. You know, put your gun, which she had already done. So she became a hero, and she's writing a book. That's what heroes do. Professors also write books. Now, this story was covered in the newspapers, but the meaning of it was not. And so this is part of what we're doing at Metta Center. We've recently trained 1,300 young people in South Africa to interpret news and to make their own news so that the meaning of these stories gets out. The meaning of the story is, in my humble opinion, we had 2 security systems in place at that school that morning. One was a very expensive system that failed. That system consisted of an electronic security gate and a SWAT team. The SWAT team actually made matters worse. When they showed up and started shouting and firing outside, they almost destroyed what Antoinette Tuff was doing. The other security system was Antoinette, a human being who was trained to recognize another suffering human being. She had a minister who had told her, given her a grounding technique that helped her do this. And the story, if you ask me, is that we're spending millions and millions of dollars on a failed system, and we're doing nothing to develop an appropriate system, a beautiful system, which worked. To give you another story really quickly. This was in a Walgreens parking lot 2 years ago, I think. There was an elderly woman, a little bit disabled, got into her car, and a young man jumped into the car and pointed a gun at her and said, "Give me all your money." She said, "Young man, Jesus is with me in this car. If you shoot me, I'm going straight to heaven, and you're going straight to hell." And the conversation continued for a little while longer, and finally the fellow started crying, which is actually fairly common in these cognitive dissonance situations that are caused by nonviolence actors. He started crying, and he put the gun away and started to get out of the car. And she said, "Wait a minute, young man," and reached in her wallet and gave him all the money she had, which was $10 or something. And again, the story was reported, but the meaning was lost. The point of the story was that this woman, who had not had the opportunity to take my course, as far as I know, she, and incidentally, when that course was, it shows you what kind of hunger there is for nonviolence. When that course went up online, in the first 6 months, there were more than 100,000 people had watched. I won't say they watched the whole course, but they had tuned into it, and it's still available on our website. And actually, in August, we're going to do the course again, but this time not at the university. Oh, no. We're going to do it at the Metta Center and webcast it from there. So I love teaching, but I hate the university. But where were we? This was a terrific cliffhanger. We're waiting to hear the meaning of the story of this poor old lady. She, as I say, she had not taken my course, but she did the perfect nonviolent thing spontaneously. Again, it shows we have this capacity within us. In fact, the more I deal with nonviolence, the more I've begun to realize, and it really has only come clear for me in the last few years, that nonviolence is the absolute core of what we are as human beings. So she had this spontaneous awareness and ability, and what she did, if we could only have somebody interpret it for us, what she did was she absolutely refused to accept the model of reality that this young man was offering her. Namely, he was saying, we are radically separate. My happiness can be built on your suffering. And she was saying, absolutely not. We are radically connected. Your happiness and mine are united. They are interconnected. And I'm happy to help you, but not under coercion. Not accepting that model of separateness, but affirming the model of connectedness. So if we ask ourselves why the journalism is so bad, okay, we're not going to be so terrifically surprised about this. I had a student of mine at Berkeley who became a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, and she told me that their motto is, if it's news to us. But there is a deeper reason behind all of this, and that the reportage is so lacking, I guess is the word I'm looking for, because we're living in the wrong story. We're living in a story of reality which says that the world consists of matter, and because it consists of matter, it consists of limited resources, and because we also consist of matter, we are radically separate from one another, and we are doomed to compete for those ever scarcer resources. And therefore, the devastation of the planet and war and the economic imbalance and all of the rest of it all comes from this wrong story. And there are people who have begun to realize that it's the story that's the problem and have been working on getting a new story. This is a quote from one of those people, Thomas Berry. We're obviously going through the deep crisis of the kind that Berry describes, where our story is inadequate for the present situation. In fact, I would say that it's worse than inadequate. It's devastatingly misleading, this story of materialism and separateness. And it's not hard at all to tell where that story is coming from. This is an advertisement I picked almost at random. See this young dude in the sports car here? I'm trying not to be jealous. Just look at the look on his face. He's got the look of an action hero and is driving some kind of very slick car. I've cut out the brand name of the car so I won't be sued. And as you can see, the exciting thing about this is that his heartbeat is matching the engine RPM. And just in case you don't get the point, don't just drive the car, be the car. Be a machine. And lest you think that this is just a one-off, according to recent studies, we're exposed to somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 commercial messages a day. You know, it'd be less than 1,000 in Seabeck, Washington, more than 6,000 in Tokyo, but somewhere in between. Most of us see 3,000 or so messages a day that are telling us we are empty, we're separate from one another, we need to compete, we need to buy more stuff, and so on and so forth. So that's where what we call the old story is coming from. Now, you might have noticed I put quote marks around old story because really it's fairly new. It started in the Industrial Revolution, which in geological times was just an eye blink ago. The new story is intimately bound up with nonviolence. Again, I don't have much of an excuse for showing this picture, but here's Martin Luther King being a very human being with his family. And it was he who said, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented civilization, which is what we have become primarily through the advertising modality of the mass media, to a person-oriented civilization. And as I say, I've noticed over and over again recently how personhood is identified with the capacity for nonviolence. Recently, Christian Peacemaker Teams was talking with a Kurdish activist in Iraqi Kurdistan who said he wanted to mount a major nonviolent campaign. The CPT person said, I guess he wasn't as well trained as FOR teams are. He said, yes, you can do that, but it's difficult, which is true. It involves some risk, which is true. It takes longer, which isn't true. We just discovered that it's about 1/3 the time if you do things through nonviolence, but they didn't know that. And the Kurdish gentleman said, yes, all of that is true. I know it's going to be more difficult, more risky, take more time, but he said you don't lose your humanity in the process. And while he was saying that, we were recently passing that barrier, that landmark, where more American servicemen and women have committed suicide than have been killed in combat. And again, we are clueless as to the reason. Oh my gosh, they must be under stress or something like that. like we're not under stress? Come on. Now, the reason is a friend of mine, a psychologist by the name of Mary McNair, some of you may know, has discovered a concept called perpetration-induced traumatic stress. It's the PITS, perpetration-induced traumatic stress. And it states that we are much more devastated by what we do to other people than what other people do to us. And it's taken us, the Army will refuse to acknowledge that this phenomenon exists because it puts them in an impossible quandary. We ought to be shaking it in their face every time we get a chance. Look at what we're doing with basic training is basic dehumanization. So where are we going to go for, quote, a new story? Actually, this is a fairly easy question to answer because the new story has been around forever, if you will. And we even have a name these days for the tradition that it comes from. It's called the wisdom tradition. And it's an eternal inheritance that every one of us can claim. It's the vision of these great sages and mystics, and this is just one testimony from an anonymous document from the 14th century England called The Cloud of Unknowing. Beneath you and external to you, that's an important point, external to you lies the entire created universe. Even the sun, moon, and the stars, they cannot compare to your exalted dignity as a human being. So this is the story that we need. And just to show you that it's not only an ancient story, this is a statement fairly recently from an Indian sage, Swami Ramdas, who actually came to this country in the 1950s in order to help us not have the Third World War. This is really such an important summary of who we are that I'd like to dwell on it for just a minute. On the physical plane, man is but an animal. Okay, let me stop there for a second. I've had a couple of conversations with very prominent, creative, brilliant people, much more successful in their fields than I am, for example. One of them is a well-known economist who runs an organization in Bainbridge Island, not far from here. No names, please. The other one is a colleague of mine from Berkeley who is a very, very well-known linguist, written a lot of books. And they have both said to me at news story conferences, when we were trying to get this quote, ancient news story out, they both said, well, look, we are animals. And fortunately, I'm a nonviolent person. But I wanted to shake them up, except one of them at least is much bigger than me, so I didn't. I wanted to shake him and say, our bodies are the bodies of animals, but we are mind, body, and spirit. And when you just keep saying we're animals, you are saying that we're back in the old paradigm, which is to say that we're physical beings trapped in this competition for scarce resources, etc., etc. But look how much further Ram Dass will go. On the intellectual plane, the human being, she or he, is a rational being. That's nice. You know, I made my living that way for a number of years. People would ask me, "You're a professor, what do you do?" And I said, well, I take simple ideas and make them complicated enough so that intellectuals can understand them. But, you know, you can make a living at anything, my grandmother used to say. On the moral plane, we are a power for good, and he goes even further than that. On the spiritual plane, we are a radiant being full of divine light, love, and bliss. And he goes on to add that we are not finished yet. Humanity's ascent from one plane to another is its natural movement. So this is the, quote, new story. It's already there. It's in every imaginable language and all kinds of different idioms and images. The problem is that we don't believe it. So we need to do two things. We need, and this is a kind of mnemonic. It's going to be easy for us to remember this. We need to adapt and adopt. We need to adapt the old story, to put it into language that we can assimilate, we modern people, for whom, as my friend Willis Harman used to say, science is the knowledge validating system for us, unless we belong to the Tea Party. And we, you know, but if you don't think that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a Tyrannosaurus Rex, you mostly believe in science, and if something cannot be validated by science, we're going to have a hard time accepting it. So we need to adapt it to language we can understand, and then, which is an even harder part, we need to adopt it. We need to make it the worldview through which most people see the world. So that when an Antoinette Tuff does what she does, we can interpret that, we can understand it, we can build upon it, we can institutionalize it, and then our problems will be over. So it just so happens, unless you believe in God, in which case you would say, by God's grace, we have just the two things that we need to do the adapting and the adopting. To do the adapting, we have this incredible revolution in science that's taken place in about the last 30, 35 years. And to do the adopting, to make the new story real, to make it how we see the world, that's where nonviolence comes in. Because for years I've been saying that the new science and the new story are helping us to establish and explain nonviolence, but it's also the other way around. That the fact that nonviolence works shows that we must be having the wrong image of the human being. If we were just material objects separate from one another, et cetera, on that animal plane, there's no way to explain why nonviolence is so effective. So I want to talk just a little bit about what this new science is and some of the newest developments in nonviolence, which mostly you're probably aware of. I got a few experiments I'd like to tell you about. Incidentally, we're trying to build a page on the Metta Center website which will summarize some of the most important findings of the new science, because I think it's an extremely valuable resource. But one of the best researchers is Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch primatologist. He wrote a book called Chimpanzee Politics, which I thought was a description of the White House, but actually it's a description of his chimpanzees at the Arnhem Zoo. And they did this following experiment. They had a colony of rhesus monkeys. Now, rhesus monkeys are pretty aggressive critters, as you can see from this picture. Of course, I've chosen the picture to show this, but never mind. Here's another. I think I recognize this one from... I met this one in Brooklyn 10 years ago. So they had these real aggressive monkeys, and they introduced, that's going to sound a little bit unkind, they introduced stump-tail monkeys, who are much more like FOR monkeys. You can see they love their kids, they're kind and gentle. And their fear was that, the rhesus monkeys are just going to wipe up the cages with the stump-tails. Well, the first of 3 big surprises was that the stump-tails actually prevailed. Rhesus monkey would kind of come up to a stump-tail and say, "Hey, get off of my branch." The stump-tail would say, "I'm not leaving. I was here first. If you have a real problem, you want to bite my finger, go ahead, bite it. But I'm not getting off the branch." Nonviolence 101. And in a short period of time, to the amazement of the researchers, the stump-tails had established themselves and refused to be cowed down by the, quote, more aggressive rhesus monkeys. Then, this is incredible, the rhesus monkeys actually started imitating the stump-tails. So stump-tail culture, this cultural nonviolence, right? Stump-tail culture prevailed over rhesus culture. And they thought, wow, this is incredible. We're going to get at least 3 PhDs out of this. Now let's pull the stump-tails out and see how long it takes for the rhesus to go back to their bad old ways. So they pulled all the stump-tails out, and the rhesus monkeys are still being stump-tail-like, the last we've heard. So peace culture is not only more potent, but more robust than violent culture. And this has also been shown from games theory and many other places. I'll mention just one other experiment just to show you how this is opening up new vistas. The fact is that if you sit in front of a computer screen and they flash a face on that screen, and that face is a person from a different race, your limbic system will get activated. That's a system way down in the animal brain, the reptilian brain actually. It has a little almond-shaped entity in there called the amygdaloid nucleus, and when it fires up, you go into a fight or flight response. So this is an unfortunate fact of evolutionary life. I'm sitting in front of a screen, they show me a picture of someone that I don't know from a different race, the amygdala gets hyperactive. Now, the 2 researchers at Princeton, who probably not by coincidence were 2 women, Mary Wheeler and Susan Fisk, decided there's got to be a way around this. And they thought of something that was incredibly brilliant. And I'm surprised that as professors, they were able to come up with something so simple. It was this. They said to the subject, okay, this is a test. We want to test your acumen here. We want you to tell us, does this person like crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter? Incredibly stupid question. And so they would do this over and over again, and you know what? It completely suppressed the amygdala response. It went that deep. It went back 300 million years in evolution and stifled that response. And the explanation for this is pretty simple. When you ask yourself a question like that, you're looking at the person as a human being, as an individual, not as a member of a threat category, other than me, different, compete, and so forth. So once again, changing to a person-oriented civilization, and this process, incidentally, is what psychologists call priming. You prime the subject with a particular question, change his or her mental set, and that changes the result of the experiment. And so you might look at advertising as incredibly bad priming that we're giving ourselves on a social level. So I guess I don't need to say much more about that particular experiment, but there are incredible results now coming in many, many fields, to the point where we have new fields of science altogether, positive psychology and so forth. And I would really urge that all of us become familiar with this because it's extremely useful material. If you haven't guessed by now, my purpose here today is to recruit you into be new storytellers. And this is one of the ways that we're going to do it. So let's go over now to the nonviolence side of the equation and ask ourselves what's new since Gandhi and King. In other words, roughly contemporaneous with this explosion of positive science in the last 30, 35 years, the discovery of mirror neurons and all of those things. At the same time, parallel discoveries are going on in nonviolence. First of all, there's an enormous quantitative spread of nonviolence, as all of us in this room know very well, because Walter Wink and Richard Dietz wrote about it in Pieces of the Way. And in Fellowship magazine, there was a very important article called The Global Spread of Active Nonviolence, which showed that if you just do population counts, slightly more than half the world at that time had experienced a major nonviolent event or campaign of some kind, many of which had been successful even by worldly standards. But in this book, I argue that we need a different set of criteria to evaluate whether something is successful or not. But even by worldly standards, most of them succeeded. And that was written before Arab Spring. So I used to go around saying, by now it's probably 2/3 of the world. And just last week, I read an article by Jack Duval from the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict saying there is hardly, and he is not a dewy-eyed romantic, Jack Duval, if you know him. He's not a racist, but he's not a sop either. He said there's hardly a society in the world today that has not experienced some kind of at least strategic nonviolent episode. So it's everywhere. The term is coming up, though not as much as we might like. In Petaluma, when I was starting to look around for the Metta office, I went into a lawyer's office and they had a room to spare and they weren't paying much attention to me. I just walked into the room and I looked at it, came out. As I was walking out, a woman behind the desk said, so what do you do? What do you want this office for? I said, well, we have a nonprofit. She said, that's nice. Still looking down at her paper. What do you do there? I say, well, we promote nonviolence. What? What kind of violence? So we're really not quite there yet, but the phenomenon, at least, is growing. And there are at least 5 qualitative things that are different and helpful. The first is that there's an enormous amount of research, not just the new science research that I was just referring to, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with this book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, documenting that of almost 300 what they call transitions to democracy. We used to call them revolutions, but now they're called transitions to democracy. 56% of the nonviolent ones were successful, and 23% of the violent ones were successful. So we're now starting to ground this scientifically. More important than that, I believe, as a frustrated activist, is the phenomenon of transmission. Read any book from the 70s or 80s about the peace movement, and they will tell you the problem with the peace movement is that it has to reinvent the wheel every time there's an event, because there's no way of learning from one event to the next. That is now changing. For example, there's an organization called Center for Advanced Nonviolent Actions and Strategies, which took the successful student-led uprising leaders from Serbia from the year 2000 and had them bundle up what they had learned and make that available. They were in Egypt. I think they were even some of them in Iran. There's some difficulties with that organization, but the fact is we're now beginning to realize that this is a human capacity. We are all potential Antoinette toughs. It's a human capacity, and we can learn it and develop it. And so this is a really big breakthrough. There are also new institutions, which, again, you know about as well as I. Here are two fellows, Derek Oakley from the UK and Andres Gutierrez from Central America, who are part of the Nonviolent Peace Force team in Jonglei State in South Sudan. They don't pick easy conflicts to go into. They were in a UN IDP camp, internal displaced persons. It was attacked by militia. They went and took shelter in a little hut. They discovered that there were 4 women and 9 children in that hut. The militia burst in with their AK-47s and axes and sticks and saw these two, obviously non-Sudanese. They're somewhat uniformed, fairly official-looking people, and said, "Get out of here." Derek and Andres were well-trained. They had done their teamwork. All they had to do was glance at one another. They knew exactly what they were going to do. They simply looked at these people very calmly and said, "We are not leaving." The militia threatened them 3 times, and 3 times they said, "I'm sorry, we're not leaving." The militia turned and went away. And so, you look at this picture, you ask yourself, why are these men smiling? They're smiling because they just saved the lives of 11 people. But they're also smiling because they have just shown a way out of the war system. And they're also smiling at the deepest level because they have upheld a deeper, newer image of the human being, where people going to a country where they're not even in the same race as the people there and risking their life solely for peace, that's a different image of the human being than what we've known before. So to go back to our story, we also have new demographics and new actors. The women's movement has been incredibly helpful, and indigenous people now have networks by which they are able to get involved in global events without losing their diversity, without losing their identity. And finally, we have the creation of the new story, which I've been talking about. This is... I hope this is the right slide. This is part of our roadmap project, which we'll be talking about in our workshop this afternoon, where we have attempted to bring nonviolent Gandhian principles to bear on the present movement and see if there's a way where, without losing our diversity, we could get the energy of a single concerted movement. And there's a trajectory from person power, our term for personal empowerment, to constructive program, to nonviolent resistance, or obstructive program, satyagraha. We stumbled on this ourselves, and then we went to Birmingham, Alabama, and had a 3-day workshop with Narayan Desai, who had grown up in Gandhi's ashram. And the first day was on the personal practices and meditation stuff in the ashram. The second day was on constructive program. And the third day was on satyagraha. So we said, we must have stumbled on something. And this person power area, we have settled on 5 practices which anyone can do, which we believe would make us more effective peacemakers and nonviolent actors, and therefore, in a way, get us a step closer to our own personal fulfillment as human beings. And the first one is the most unpopular by far, and that is avoid the mass media. I think we'd agree. Yep. If you want to get a little bit more finessed, you could say, don't expose yourself to images of human degradation, but it amounts to the same thing. This will create a vacuum in your mind, which the Metta Center will then come over the hill waving its banner and say, hey, we can help you learn everything you can about nonviolence. It's actually a substitute culture, an alternative culture. Get a spiritual practice. Say a little bit more about that in a second. Try to relate to everyone personally. Our civilization has caused us to be so isolated from one another. In fact, even those who are big fans of social media have started pointing out that, you walk down the street and people are listening to somebody else or not looking at you. Okay, I don't want to dilate too much on that story, and then finally, this I think is very important. Tell the story. Now, Nick Rockefeller once tried to recruit a very wealthy friend of his into being an economic hitman. Come with me, we'll go down to Guatemala, we can destroy the economy of the whole country, just a snap, and we'll make millions. And to his surprise, this wealthy friend of his who had been investing with him and so forth said, no, I don't want to do that. And Rockefeller said to him, why do you care about those people? Now, by and large, when we hear something like that, we say, okay, if you have to ask the question, then I can't explain it to you. But I'm thinking that we should be able to explain it. Because people complain, that the Republicans have their own story. They have this horrible little story. They keep telling it over and over again, and it matters, it counts. So we also should be able to articulate, and this is what we're going to be practicing a little bit at the workshop. Well, okay, if someone says, why do you care about these people? Because we're all interrelated. Life, it turns out, is not made up of separate material particles, as I was taught in high school a long time ago, but rather because we are body, mind, and spirit, we are all interconnected, and if I hurt you, I'm hurting myself. You may not believe me, but anyway, that's where I stand. That's why I'm not going to do this with you. So Gandhi obviously was one who had a very deep spiritual practice. He called it prayer meeting, but my spiritual teacher actually got started as a seeker by going to one of these, quote, prayer meetings and seeing Gandhi go into a state like this of complete absorption. And it was because of that that he was able to hit on this incredible scheme of picking up a pinch of salt in April of 1930 and bringing down the British Empire. Unbelievable, but he had the insight to do that. And it's because of that that he had the ability to win people over. These are the wives and workers of the Lancashire steel mills. He had put them out of a job by boycotting British cloth. And they warned him, don't go there in 1931 in Lancashire. And he said, where? I want to meet these people. And it took him about half an hour to explain what he was doing. He said, you have 300,000 unemployed, I have 300 million unemployed, and things like that. And at the end of it, you have this scene which I call "Ip Ip Hooray." Where So and Thich Nhat Hanh also said that you may believe in nonviolence, but unless you have some meditation practice when you're facing the dogs and when they're hitting you with the sticks, that belief is going to go out the window. It's just relatively superficial. You need to ground it every day in a practice. And if you're looking for one, we may have some suggestions that will help you. The deepest wisdom doesn't come either from scientists or the wisdom tradition, sages and saints. It comes from bumper stickers. And this one was tacked onto a guitar that was hanging on the fence at a friend of mine's front yard in Tamales. We are not human beings having a spiritual experience, which is a very Californian thing to believe. We are actually spiritual beings having a human experience. I will say no more about that just now, but we have developed what we call Charka points. It used to be called bullet points, but that's too violent for us. So these are spinning wheel points, which we propose that if we were to assimilate this, make it our own, and use it whenever we get an opportunity, even sometimes when we don't get an opportunity, just walk into a bar and say, you realize that we're body, mind, and spirit? And there are four things, I think, that would probably, and this is a work in progress. If you have other suggestions about what are the basic Charka points that we should be promoting, I would be more than happy to hear them. We really are I really feel that if we get people talking about why we're doing what we're doing, the combination of the effective nonviolent action and the plausible explanation could be very, very powerful. So those points are the unity of life. I think, Kristen, you were saying last night about Thich Nhat Hanh, talking that we inter-are. And I didn't make up the slide after I heard your talk. I already had this. And that we are not determined by our DNA or our neurons or hormones or anything else, but this is what the newspapers will, just about once a day, they will report on a scientific experiment that says that you are a Republican because of this gene, or you like crunchy peanut butter because of that hormone. And it's totally untrue. We have this irreducible free will, as the priming experiment of Wheeler and Fisk were able to demonstrate. We have tremendous inner resources which are constantly concealed from us by this advertising that we need things from the outside world. And of all of those inner resources, I would say the capacity to be nonviolent and to respond to nonviolence when we encounter it is deepest, perhaps the deepest part of our human nature. So I put this before you as a version of the new story, which if you feel comfortable with it, you might want to adopt. And I'll just close with a little anecdote if I can get through it. It often causes me to get emotional. Professors are not supposed to do that, but the day after Gandhi's assassination, 1948, there was an American journalist in the south of India who was overwhelmed. Imagine being in a subcontinent with nearly 400 million people, every one of whom was going through a paroxysm of grief. He had never experienced anything like it. He went to one of his Indian friends and said, "What is going on here?" And the man said, well, the people believed that there was a mirror in the Mahatma in which was reflected the greatest that we are capable of. And we are now afraid that that mirror has been shattered. So the story that I have been trying to share with you this morning is that the mirror has not been shattered. It's been covered over with a lot of dust. And perhaps this will be a way for us to blow away some of that dust and realize who we are. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Barb from Vancouver. And you talked at the beginning about human beings not being just animals. But to me, I think part of the new story would be that we are animals.
Yeah, my dog would be very disappointed in me if I completely disagreed with you. Yeah, I understand very well. I think there's two issues here. We are one with animals in the love of life, in the ability to empathize. But I do believe, without for 1 minute, and don't get me wrong, I've been a vegetarian for 40 years, mostly for this reason, because of my love of animals. But without being romantic about it, I think I have to admit that I also have higher capacities which animals don't have, which doesn't make me more worthy of living than them, but means I have a deeper responsibility. I see some friends of mine went away on a vacation and left their dog with their children. I saw the children and the dog walking across the meadow, and I said, that dog is not going back. When the parents come to recover the dog, he's not going to leave. So the parents came, knowing nothing, picked up the dog, went home. And I said, all right, maybe I was wrong. 3 days later, there's a phone call. I guess you have to have Duffy now. She won't eat. So animals are capable, as I said with the stump tails, they're capable of what I think I would have to call a primordial nonviolence-like response, but I believe that they can't choose it. We have the choice. Am I going to pick up the gun or put out my hand in friendship? And in that struggle, I think we realize ourselves as human beings. So because I think we have a more developed capacity, I don't feel the slightest bit separate from them. But I feel that there is something about the fact that I'm a human being that I have to respond to and live up to. Thank you for raising that question.
Michael, I appreciate your opening story about Antoinette Tuff and how she rewrote the script when that wild gunman came into the school. And one of the things that I appreciate most about nonviolence as a methodology is rewriting the script, because we know how a crazed gunman entering a school is supposed to play out, and it involves the SWAT team, as you mentioned, and it, you know, case after case after case, the script plays out a certain way in the popular way of thinking. Nonviolence rewrites the script. It would be interesting if I want to offer this as something for you to invite us to do, is as we go back to our home communities after this conference weekend, look for those places in our local communities where there's some violence or some injustice that has been persisting, and see what we could do to help treat the other parties in that conflict, each other, as human beings, and rewrite the script about that. So that's, have you experimented with urging people to do this in their local community, find one set of injustice or one set of ongoing violence, and invite people to rehumanize the participants and rewrite the script?
Thanks very much. I think, what we've been trying to do is rewrite the frame narrative in which the scripts will be told, will be played out. But I take that as a very useful challenge. We'll be doing something like that in the workshops, where we'll be asking people, what is your issue that you're working on, and how would you describe this in terms of the new story? You know, give your rationale for why you're doing it. That would be a step toward the process that you're suggesting there. And I think, I take that under advisement. Thank you.
I'll make it quick. And I know that Michael has heard this before, but there is no such thing as a flight or fight reflex. There is an action reflex. We aren't given a hormone when we're excited with that says you must flee or fight. What we're given is the energy and this huge outpouring to act. And how we act is our choice. And it comes from our culture. As long as we keep saying fight or flight, people think there are two choices. That's not true. There's a spectrum of choices, and that's part of the new story.
Amen. Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you. Excellent. The other announcement I want to make is Metta Center also publishes a monthly journal called Emergence, which is done by a photojournalist who's our outreach director, who's based in India. And you can get it online. Every month there's a different issue. This last one was Tibet, and I think the next one is coming up. Might be terrorism. I'm not sure. I was supposed to write something for it, but I forgot. So it's a very well turned out, very attractive journal. Bijoyetta does a very, very good job. So what we're going to do now is talk about one of Metta's major projects, which is called Roadmap. And the point of the project is, as I mentioned yesterday, to take the marvelous energies of peace work that are going on around the world and to see if there's a way that we can harmonize it into a movement without losing the diversity of the different projects and the different people doing them. We all, I think, are familiar with Paul Hawkins' study called Blessed Unrest, and even if we weren't familiar with that, those of us who've been in the peace movement for a long time, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, because I think that might be superfluous here, but we've all been feeling that something isn't gelling, something isn't, happening powerfully enough. And I am absolutely convinced that with nonviolence, we can create an unstoppable movement. There is nothing that can stop the power of nonviolence when it's mobilized correctly. So that's why we started Roadmap. And incidentally, well, let me just back up for a second. So I'm going to try to describe how the thing works. That should take about a half hour, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for breaking into groups and doing exercises around Roadmap, which we're very thrilled to be starting that now, and then come back and share ideas. Okay? And we were thinking that maybe we could just go out on the lawn if it's not raining for our breakouts. This is designed for a workshop of about 24 people, so we've had to be a little bit flexible. So the way the Roadmap came about is also of interest. We have an institution at the Metta Center. It takes place once a month now. It used to be once a week. It's called the Hope Tank. And it got started because I said to a young friend of mine very proudly one day, I was still kind of a university man, I guess, and I said, I want to start a new think tank. And I was startled to see the lack of enthusiasm, her reaction. She said, "We do not need another think tank." She said, "We need a hope tank." I immediately got it. And here's how Hope Tank works. We meet at 8:30 in the morning for a half hour of silent meditation together. And then we have a potluck breakfast. And then we have a conversation. And there are two rules for the conversation, which are mutually contradictory. I like that aspect of it. The conversation has to be open but focused. It's focused on a real issue that is of real concern in the peace, social justice general area. So, for example, we have a friend in San Jose who's confronting immigration issues all the time. She's brought that up several times to be the topic, and we've had many other people with different interests come in. So it's focused on that kind of issue. It's not an abstract, theoretical presentation. And it's open in the sense that anything that you want to bring to the table that you think could be of use in solving that issue, please bring it forward. It's going to be like a brainstorm. So we don't say a priori, we don't like that kind of idea. We're not looking for that sort of thing. Tell us why you think it could be useful, and we'd be happy to discuss it. So it's from these conversations going back over several years that we developed what is now known as Roadmap. And at one time it was called PUP, which stood for the Progressive Unity Project. And before that it was called Enchilada, because it was the whole enchilada. But now it's Roadmap. And I'm telling you about Hope Tank because different groups have started doing this on their own, and we found it's a very good model, and we're absolutely not proprietary about it. So anyone who wants to do it, by all means, give it a try and let us know how it works. Okay. So what is Roadmap? As a project, Roadmap has 3 phases, and we are about in the middle, or about 1.5 ways into the project. The first part of the project, which came directly out of Hope Tank conversations, was to develop this beautiful mandala that you see behind me, which is a schematic representation of the entire progressive movement, as you can see. And the second part of the project was to create a web-based tool through which people working on any part of the roadmap could connect with people working on that issue. So let's say, well, let's just take by, arbitrarily, you're interested in peace. Why should anyone be interested in peace? But you are. So you click on that little dove icon. I didn't choose that dove, by the way. I've gotten quite allergic to them over the years, but our designer is very good and I don't tamper with her work. So you would click on that, and that clicks you through. Well, right now what you'll find is a Facebook-based blog of people who are interested in that issue. But eventually what we'd like to do is to make it a kind of visual database of other groups working in that issue. So people who have signed up and said they don't mind being contacted by others will appear there on a kind of map, and you'll be able to get in touch with them and share resources, like to say, okay, I'm a terrific web designer, someone in this area needs web design, you connect up that way. And more importantly, even than that, I think, start to share resources. So here are best practices for promoting peace work. Here's things that we found don't work. Here's things that we want to wait on, etc. And so that'll be phase 2, and we're almost there. I think we need to raise a little more money and get another phase of the web design completed. So we're working with a group called Lancashire that has almost this functionality already. I can't tell you exactly when, but I think that before long, you'll be able to go on and connect through to other people who are working in the area that you're mostly interested in. Understood. We're all interested in different areas, and at different times you may want to connect up with other groups. That's fine. So that's phase 2. Phase 3, this is where it gets really exciting. And I guess I know the least about how this phase is going to work, but the point of phase 3, believe it or not, I should have a drum roll or something here to build up the tension. Thank you, or the Occupy version of a drum roll, yeah, is to come up with a long-term strategy, a strategy for the entire movement. And just keep that on hold for a little bit, and I'm going to go back to the beginning, work my way up to that, and I'll tell you how we think that might work. Okay? So any questions so far? I mean, what I was going to do next is kind of go up to the mandala and show you what the different sectors are, why it's designed the way it is. The web-based tool, we're calling that the compass. So there are 3 terms, the mandala, the compass, and the strategy. And anyone who's involved in this, we're calling them travel agents. So let me point out that if you look at the brochure, the middle column on the bottom is all about the Metta Center. When this goes online shortly, you'll also be able to download a version of it where that whole part of the column is blank. The point being that you can take it and use it for your own organization. Right? So we are completely open source. Whatever organization you want, as long as you want to be considered a collaborator with the Metta Center on the Roadmap project, you just bang your own logo on there. You know. So here is how this thing works. The issues that we need to address to change the world, to get the great turning to happen, to get to the new paradigm, whatever we want to call it. We spent a lot of time filtering that down to 6 basic areas. And the area that we put top dead center, because we consider it the most important, is what I was talking about this morning, the creation of a new story, creation and adopting of a new vision of who we are and what the world is, what we're supposed to be doing here, etc. Now, each of these 6 sectors is divided into 3 subsectors. Those are only for example. There are many, many projects that you could put in there. Gandhi had 18 projects in his constructive program. So we thought, this is a magic number. We want to have 18 also. So we do. But that was just, our self-indulgence, and you don't have to pay too much attention to that part. But we feel that peace, democracy, and social justice, the economy, And then climate and the environment we gave separate sectors to because of the extreme urgency of the climate issue. I mean, there's one thing that all of us agree on is if we don't resolve that one very soon, I mean, even in my lifetime, there will be no more issues for us to resolve. So for that reason, we broke it out into two. Now, this is where it starts to be very Gandhian. We propose that this be regarded as a centrifugal trajectory, that all of us are going to do something about our own personal empowerment. It would be through, and here's where we suggested those 5 points this morning of avoiding the mass media, learning everything you can about nonviolence, get a spiritual practice, relate very personally to others. I might just mention here that a friend of mine, years ago, there were these things called telephones. You picked them up out of a device and you moved your finger like this. And he had trouble with his telephone, so he went down to Ma Bell to get his bill straightened out. And they said, oh, we can take care of you. Go to that desk over there, sit in that chair and dial the following number. So he sits down, he dials the number, and he's having a conversation with the person who's very helpful, but there's this weird kind of echo going on, and so he turns around and the guy is sitting right behind him. But God forbid they should have a human connection when there's a machine that we could put in between. So we want to deliberately go against that tendency to create a person-based civilization. And then finally, find your passion is the way we put it in this version here. Where do your strengths and weaknesses most closely match the needs of the world? And what we would now add to that is to use every opportunity to tell the new story. And we're going to be doing an exercise about that shortly. So at this point, we actually numbered these stages. We don't necessarily mean that these things have to be chronological. If you're working on something urgent, like climate change, we're not saying drop everything, start meditating, go to Tibet, and come back when you're illumined. It's not like that. But above all, we should never neglect personal development because that's how we lead to burnout, lack of discrimination, and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's all I need to tell you about how the mandala works. Oh, no, that isn't. I forgot one of the neatest things. And that is that Gandhi had a concept called Swadeshi, which meant, suppose you could roughly translate that as localism, and it meant working within your own sphere. And when you had done your job correctly in your sphere, your capacities would expand, and you'd find yourself able to work in a broader sphere. But he was very, very serious about Swadeshi. People come to him and say, I want to join the movement. And he would say, where do you come from? And the person would name a village, and Gandhi would be familiar with that village because he had visited so many of them. He would say, your village is a mess. Your village is a cesspool. For you to come and join the national movement and leave your village in that condition would be a sin. You go back and work in your village. And the same could be applied, and he did apply it, to our personal capacities. Like we have strengths and weaknesses, we should be aware of them, working on them. When we do our job in that circle, however small it may be, our capacities will expand. And without being conscious of it, this centrifugal model is a very good Swadeshi model because here, and we're actually going to imitate that in our workshops starting in a little while. Here, in person power, you're working on yourself. It's very Swadeshi. In constructive program, you're working with your friends to build the things that you need, getting together with your community members and so forth. When you've done those two things, then you're ready to confront the powers that be. And of course, we designed this as a kind of reaction to Occupy, which went exactly the other way. So let's start by protesting at the biggest scale possible. And then when we're thrown off the street, then they discovered constructive program. At least they did that much, because a lot of people, when they fail at a big outside circle, or they fail when they start by means of protest, they often give up. And many a movement has gone through that cycle. So much to their credit that they went on to discover Occupy Sandy and Occupy Jubilee and things like that. But there's a great strength that comes from starting with the smallest possible circle, and then nobody can prevent us from self-empowerment. And it's entirely within our purview. We don't have to join an organization, form a new 501c3 called the Michael Nagler Improvement Project, or whatever. And then to get together with people to build the things that we want is a very powerful predecessor to saying we don't want the things that you have built. And if you get a hold of my book, you'll see that I devoted a chapter to constructive program because it is so often overlooked and is so powerful. So that's the general idea. It's a Swadeshi model. Let's be working on ourselves. Let's try whatever issue we're working on. It's a good idea to try to ask ourselves, how could we work on this constructively? If we don't like the educational system, and I'm being personal here, instead of protesting the university, tearing it down, so forth, let's start with building our own educational system. So for example, as I said this morning, I'm going to be teaching my course at the Metta Center. Just a little room. We're going to be making our own certificates. Thank you very much. This and $1.50, and you can get a latte in a nearby cafe. But I feel good about starting with what we can build, and then on that basis, being able to say to the powers that be, we don't need you. Imagine if Gandhi had asked everybody in India to burn all their British cloth, period. That would have meant that you would have a country that looked like it was on that beach in San Francisco, in California, where people go around in their birthday suits. They wouldn't have had any clothes. So first, the idea was reignite the famous cotton industry of India, make our own clothes, and then say to the British, we don't need you for this. Okay? So that is the basic idea. Let's see. So when it comes to the formation of the strategy, let me see. I think there's two things I need to say before we go into workshops. The first is, I think I started touching on this morning what we mean by the new story. And in some ways it's fairly obvious, but in some it's not. As I mentioned, I talk to people who are very prominent and very effective and very active in this area, but without realizing it, part of their thinking is still stuck in the old paradigm. Now, I'm using very value-loaded language, but I can't help it. But I've been at meetings where half of the scientists are saying that mind operates on brain or operates with the neurons of the brain, and half of them are saying that the brain causes the mind. And it's something we really have to kind of decide, and I'm really encouraging people to find out what is meant by downward causality. Upward causality means matter creates energy, creates consciousness, which is kind of the model that the old paradigm has. It's basically ridiculous. I'm sorry, but I said it and I'm glad. How inert matter creates Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it's beyond me to understand. The primary reality in the universe is obviously consciousness. And this is what was discovered by quantum theorists. And it's consciousness in its form as energy that creates, I'm being very careful with my language here, that creates the appearance of matter. Because if you ask any nuclear physicist or any mystic, they will both tell you that matter is appearance only. It is not the solid reality that we think it is. It's pretty reliable. If I sit on the chair, I'm probably not going to hit the floor and damage my coccyx, but it's only reliable in this macroscopic world that we live in. Now, everything that I just shared with you, you do not need to tell your neighbor. Right? You don't need to go out there and say, "Oh, this car that you spent so much money on, it isn't real." Don't do that. Don't pull the rug out from under them. But it is I think, very important for us to maintain that as human beings, we are body, mind, and spirit. And the problem with our civilization and its narrative is that we've neglected spirit. Totally. Just one, well, I was going to give you a horrible example. I think I'll give you a nicer one. Obviously, when cell phones came out, people started having many more car accidents. So there was a study to discover how many more car accidents they had. The answer was 4 times more likely. If you're on your cell phone while you're driving, you're 4 times more likely to crash. So then they said, why could this be? Well, it must be because you don't have both hands on the wheel, right? So they went back and did another study to factor out how many of them are hands-hold and how many of them stick in your ear, and it made absolutely no difference. Finally, they were forced to admit that there is such a thing as concentration. You know, it's a shocking revelation for people in the old paradigm. So we would like people to be familiar with that basic model of the human being as body, mind, and spirit, and then as spirit, if you recall the Charka points for this morning, we are deeply interconnected, we're independent, we have immense capacities for love and wisdom within us, such that we do not need to ravish the outside world in order to get fulfillment. In fact, it's never been done. There's an Indian sage I like very much who had said, there is no happiness in any object of the world. And yet the advertisers are telling us, you know, just the next object is going to do it for you, and it's on sale right now. And then finally, that among the inner capacities that we have, one of the most characteristic is the capacity for nonviolence. Now, you may not want to use precisely that version, but if in some way you're able to articulate what you're doing, and if we're all doing that, and if we're all reasonably consistent, I think this could be very powerful. I think it would sum up to a tipping point where suddenly the news story would be what people think is real. And we all know that these things can shift very quickly when you reach a given point. Okay. So that about the news story, and I'm probably forgetting something, Prashant, but yes, thank you very much. He not only knows how to fix the microphones, but he remembers what I was trying to talk about. We have a couple of general ideas that we'd like to share with you by way of seeding this process of creating a strategy. One of them is pretty bold. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Sarvodaya project in Sri Lanka. They developed, they were blending Gandhian and Buddhist values and came up with, among other things, this idea of a 500-year plan for peace. We thought of, okay, we're Americans, let's make it a 100-year plan. But no, you know, in the end, I was outvoted on that. We're just going to stick a 500-year plan for right now. And the idea is that thinking that far down the road completely disinhibits our imagination. So, you know, if you think what we would like the Pacific Northwest to look like, in 10 years, we're trammeled by the problems that we already have. But in 500 years, we could imagine that every one of these problems has been solved. And that gives us an image that is really attractive. It's a great attractor to draw ourselves towards. Now, the great British historian Arnold Toynbee once said, and we quote him endlessly, he said, apathy can only be overcome by enthusiasm. Okay, so far you didn't need to be a PhD to follow this. Okay, but he goes on to say, and for enthusiasm you need 2 things. You need an idea that can capture the imagination by storm, and you need a concrete, plausible plan for putting that idea into practice. You know, if we sit here and we create a vision of a utopia, where everybody's floating around with wings and playing electric harps and things like that. It is not in itself going to be inspiring. So the idea is that the 500-year vision is the idea that takes the imagination by storm, and to make it practical, what they did in Sri Lanka, and what we're also suggesting we try to do, is step it back by stages. So to get to a world of complete peace and harmony in 500 years, in this one particular area, let's say the environment, where do we need to be in 400 years? And where do we need to be at 250, and step it down to what we need to do today? And then when you do that, you can see that even the smallest step now takes on this tremendous meaning, because it's part of a great trajectory leading somewhere where our children's children's children will benefit. So we feel very good about this scheme, and let me give you one example that we've cooked up of a stepwise process. Now, you know that there's a number of groups like World Beyond War and others that are trying to end the war system. And personally, I don't like the war system. It's just a quirk of mine. My favorite bumper sticker is one that says, "I'm already against the next war." And I am perfectly in line with their values and their vision, but what we need is a practical stepwise plan to get there. And we've been toying with this idea. Let's take something that goes in that direction, which is already doable. And one of those things would be, what if we got restorative justice into the nation's schools? You know, it's already sort of happening, and the results are wonderful. There's this one school in Connecticut, which was like such a tough school that no principal could survive more than 4 years. And this one young person came in and said, "Let me see what I could do." They told him, "You're crazy. This is a career breaker. This school is going to destroy you." The first thing he did was fire the security staff. Yay. Yeah. And then he took all the money that he saved from the security staff and started an art program. And in 2 years, there was no more violence problem at that school. So, and we at the Metta Center were working with these 4 high school kids from Santa Rosa who started something called SURJ, S-U-R-J, which stands for Students United for Restorative Justice. And we're close to, it's conceivable that, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years, something like that, we could have a robust restorative justice system which would be the norm in most of the nation's schools. And then when we had that, we could go on CNN or Bill Moyers or do a TED Talk and say, look, if this thing works in the schools, well, you know, the schools are just a subset of society. Why don't we do it in the whole criminal justice system? So given some more time, we could take that step. I mean, if we said tomorrow, let's convert the entire criminal justice system to restorative rather than retributive, it would seem incredible. But with this step of starting in the schools as an experiment and then going to the criminal justice system, and then when we've got that working, say, you know what, I don't think we need war anymore. We could take a restorative approach to international problems. We've done it at the school level, we've done it at the social level, now let's do it at the world level. So that kind of thinking, now obviously that's kind of 3 big leaps, and we can think of breaking them down into smaller ones, but that's an example of how we could come up with a 500-year plan for peace. Okay? And if we all voted in today, well, you know, we can start it tomorrow. But I put that out there as an example of how we could think in given areas of doing the plan. Okay.
Okay, I rarely speak on a mic, so let me know if I am too loud or too low. So this is an exercise to help you internalize this roadmap and this kind of thinking. So if you all have the map, or if your neighbor has a map, try to find yourself on the map pick an issue that you are passionate about, and at which layer of the map are you in? Are you in the constructive layer or the resistance layer? And just try to absorb it. You think 5 minutes?
Yeah, let's take 5 minutes for that.
And think of it in the context of the new story that Michael has been talking about.
So I guess basically there's probably 12 possibilities because we're all in the inner circle in some way or another, but we should see, I'm working on peace and I'm doing it mostly constructively, or I'm working on the economy and I'm doing it by blowing up my neighborhood bank. It'd be those possibilities. So just take a few minutes to try to find yourself there.